Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gesha Passiflora wet semi-anaerobic double fermentation processed Colombia from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Mood Trap, based out of Singapore, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel twice before, having previously reviewed their Gesha Village and Morona Zamora coffees, both of which I enjoyed so much that they still remain as two of my favorite coffees from the entirety of 2023. So it's safe to say that we went into this review with some very high expectations. Couple that with the fact that we heard from a number of people that the 2022 version of this coffee was their favorite Mood Trap coffee ever, and that just added to those already high expectations. So it'll definitely be interesting to see if this one could live up to all of those expectations, as this right here is day 88. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. With this one, we went even more fine than that, so just a little bit more fine than you would typically go on your V60 for the grind on this one. Roast profile for this coffee, as we've alluded to with our previous Mood Trap reviews, they are one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in the entire world. And given that we've seen some shifts from some other coffee roasters, we can say that this is one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters out there, as this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 60, first impression, and this is the thing about this coffee, and it's one of the first notes I should have about it, is that we received this coffee just before we were about to go to Japan. So as a result, they usually say started around the day 40 mark, but since we were gone at that day 40 mark, we didn't have the opportunity to start it all the way up to the day 60 mark. So here we are, day 60, and the cup was lively and vibrant right from the start, as it immediately gave shades of the, say, 2022 Latte Lino washed Panamanian Gesha coffee, as there was a very strong passion fruit forward component right at the forefront, an extremely clean sense. There was an abundance of other fruit profiles also present with the listed apple brightness, as well as an ever so slight tart aspect. So for the most part, it was a very interesting first impression. I'm not entirely sure if it's what I was expecting, but given that it was reminiscent of a very well-renowned Panamanian Gesha coffee, that's obviously going to be off to a very nice start. We continue on to day 63, opted for the Chemex, and the cup felt instantly almost stripped back on this day, as it wasn't quite as intense, but rather offering a surprisingly high level of clarity given what this coffee is. The processing that they do have on here doesn't necessarily lend itself to it being an overly heavy or fermenty coffee, but even by that standard, it shouldn't have necessarily come out maybe as clean as it was on this day. Plenty of that fruit-like profile present yet again to complement the passion fruit. At this time, I would describe it as a slight kiwi-like attribute. And for me, it's this kind of papery taste to it. And I know that sounds weird, but that's kind of the way that kiwi has always tasted in coffee for me. It opens up to a slightly more complex cup before cooling down into what I felt like was a dark jello-like sweetness and more of the apple dark fruit brightness to match as well. So notes right at the start, a little all over the place. They'll get focused a little bit more. So on day 65, we opted for the April brewer, and the cup was the most tame it had been up to this point, as it was a much more subtle experience with the softer floral expression to the cup on this day being the most notable thing. In addition to that, there was an apple fruit brightness present yet again, though it was also toned down, so a lot of these attributes were much more toned down on this day, so it just kind of left an okay day impression on this one. Continued to day 68, up to temperatures, and went with a more fine grind, and the coffee continues to come out slightly more tame in general, especially relative to the first expectations and first experiences I'd had from this one, as it's pretty clean with more of that kiwi-like profile to the cup and softer citric attributes. Listed apple continues to feel apt, as there's a fair bit of that and a tart sense to the cup. More adjustments felt like they were needed, as that first impression yielded a very defined, somewhat passion fruit-like component. From this point going forward, the cup has been a lot more tame and just skewing in these softer directions in general. Day 71, Back through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the cup continues to feel stripped back as it's generally more moderate with nice clarity. And that's what I kept getting away from the Chemex, was just added clarity, which I didn't necessarily feel was something needed for this coffee, as it was already a pretty clean coffee to begin with. Continuing to feel a lot of those kiwi-like aspects as the most notable components to the cup. Opens up a lot more as it has cooled down with a defined bergamot attribute, tart fruit brightness, and plenty of the brighter citric components to it as well. So picking out a bunch of things, the tricky thing about the coffee was right off brew, it was pretty moderate, pretty tame, and you really needed to let it cool down before it did open up a fair bit, and at that point there was a little left of it that it really didn't seem to have the same sort of impact as maybe it might have earlier. Day 74 went even more fine on the grind, and this is the best the coffee had been up to this point, and that's why I said, okay, I just need to keep grinding more and more fine because it just seems to continue to remain so moderate and tame. And this is the best it had felt because it had much more of the better defined components in this cup, specifically the listed nectarine. And up to this point, I've been kind of scratching my head saying, where is this nectarine? Where is this stone fruit component supposed to be, as I'm not experiencing any of it? It was there. It was present to complement a semi-sweet, not so bitter citric component. That kiwi-like aspect is present yet again. So these things, I'm starting to experience a fair bit of them. Greater definition, even if they're not necessarily the most pronounced or we'll just say vibrant component in this cup. Day 78, one more try through the V60, and the citrus was a little bit more pronounced on this day as the listed bergamot was at the forefront. It is growing intensity just a little bit with a little bit more time. Most of the sweetness experienced to this point is a little bit more in the sugary stone fruit sense, so that's also a nice positive. It's a little bit more of this jammy sort of stone fruit, so I could see something like an apricot as opposed to a nectarine. But yeah, that's kind of been the experience of this coffee, is just trying to get a lot more intensity out of it, as the first cup yielded potential for intensity, but throughout the entirety of the time drinking it from that point going forward here on day 88, just a little bit more difficult really pulling a lot of that out from this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, yes. And it's one of the first things I alluded to when discussing this coffee, was that it did come out a little bit more clean than expected. Honestly, I had some pretty high expectations for the Mood Trap coffees in general to still offer great clarity, even if they are more processed coffees. Again, the processing on this one's a little different and interesting, so I don't necessarily think it was ever going to lend itself to being a heavier or more fermenty cup of coffee. But even then, having a level 4 clarity as your baseline is at least a nice starting point for this one. Finish, level 4. Yes, and that's kind of a tricky one because it does have that citric finish, but also that stone fruit finish, both of which kind of seem to even out without extending too far, but it's because the cup in general is just a little bit more subtle to begin with. So yeah, level 4 seems pretty nice there. Sweetness, level 4, yes. With all of the discussion I've had about this coffee being more moderate and tame, there's still enough sweetness where I'm like, okay, worst case scenario, lower side of level 4, but most specifically in terms of a fruit direction, there is plenty of it, enough to justify that level 4 mark. So that seems to work for me. Don't have too much to add to that. Florality, level 4. Yes, and maybe this is one of the things I've downplayed the most within this coffee. There is a kind of citric floral Gesha-like florality in this coffee, and I don't think that will be unexpected, but it was maybe one of the underrated parts of this coffee because there are shades of brilliance within this coffee. There were sips I had between sips that were kind of mediocre where I'm like, wow, this coffee is really impressive. There's so much potential in here, but I just couldn't replicate that sip from sip. This coffee just seemed to offer a little less consistency than I might have been hoping for. But the florality, level 4, yes, it's got that really nice kind of white flower component to it. Citrus fruit, level 3, correction, level 4, yes, and the bergamot that I mentioned at the time. It felt like the most defined attribute within this one, so don't have too much to add to that. Definitely justified there. Stone fruit, level 4. I think by the end, I was experiencing so much more of it than I had right at the onset. Probably at the higher side of level 2, it was kind of transitioning up to that level 3 before it really reached that level 4 mark, being in about as equal measure to the citrus fruit in this coffee. So both those things at the level 4, that seems to work for me. We'll continue on. Body, level 3. Yes, surprisingly a fair bit of texture given that this is a Gesha. Probably has to do with the fact that it's a Colombian coffee still, so medium bodied, level 3, seems to work. Acidity, level 3. Maybe one of the more surprising attributes in this tasting wheel, as this one did have a little bit of brightness, but maybe not quite as much brightness as I might have been expecting. Perhaps the kind of tinkering with the temperatures might have played a slight role in that, as I do feel like there were times I'm like, this could be a level 4, but keep in mind that I'm drinking this coffee alongside of a bunch of other things, typically at least one other Kenya, and I said to myself, this one doesn't have that same level of brightness, so level 3 seems to be a better place to put that. Berry fruit, level 3. Yes, it's that kiwi-like attribute that I've been mentioning so much throughout this review, and that's where that level 3 comes into play. Looking at the rest of this tasting wheel, caramel level 2 just insinuates a slight candied aspect to it, but as I'm looking at the rest of this tasting wheel, I don't think that there's anything else to add. I do think that it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I briefly mentioned it when discussing the tasting wheel, and that's that this coffee offered glimpses of brilliance, and I think that's what's really been frustrating about this one specifically for me, is that I knew at times there's a better cup of coffee that can be had from this one, and a number of things could have been at play. First of which could have been that maybe it was better on its earlier days. Maybe from that day 40 to day 60 mark, this coffee was actually at its best. And opening this coffee up post that day 60 mark, it was already kind of tapering off and on the downslope for it. So that could have happened. It could have also been on me not being able to get the best out of this coffee, though. The previous experiences I had had with Mood Trap's coffees were that they were so easy to get right, and no matter what I did, I was able to get a really nice cup of coffee from them. So this one right here, it's also a possibility that since I had to brew with lower dosages, since this is just a 100-gram bag, that I wasn't able to get the same sort of results from it either. There are a number of factors that could have happened here, but that's basically to say that I saw glimpses of brilliance. I just wasn't able to get the best out of this coffee, at least in my impression, which kind of leads to this one being a slight bit of an underwhelming experience given just how much hype there was going into it. It was still a nice coffee, but I was expecting this one to maybe be a little bit of a game changer, whereas for me, I just couldn't get that from this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I do have to think on that, because I think maybe the passion fruit that I experienced, at least at the start, was the first direction I would initially want to point somebody towards. But given that I also struggled to replicate that, as it wasn't overly present in the rest of my notes, the things that were really most notable were the citric components in the finish that were ever so slight, as well as the stone fruit aspects that became a little bit more pronounced towards the end. So maybe the best is to say lighter profiled, complex fruit components within a cup, still offering great clarity, because as I keep alluding to, this is a little bit more processed of a coffee, but it still offers really nice clarity right from the onset. So those things, more subtlety and a nice bit of florality, kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards with this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gesha Passiflora wet, semi-anaerobic, double fermentation processed Colombia from Mood Trap Coffee. Thank you for watching.